like Facebook always gives us some kind of an issue or something. So hopefully that will straighten up. I want to say to everybody that if you're watching this on Facebook and for some reason it doesn't work on Facebook or it stops or something, you can go to our YouTube channel. You can also watch this on our live stream on our website as well. I'm looking at both of those online, and it looks like both of those are working so far. So if for some reason the chat stops or anything like that, you can look at it on one of these other platforms. Again, glad to have you with us. Jack, since I see you on here, I'm seeing kind of a glitch or something in the picture. Is that showing through on your side? If you can give me a thumbs up or a quick something, I might have to restart this just to make sure everything's working properly. And so if you want to, grab your Bibles and let's go to Revelation. We're going to be working this time and looking this time studying in Revelation chapter 4. We're going to be looking at Revelations chapter 4, chapter 4 through 7. 4 through 7. All right, double checking this. Again, making sure. All right, Jack says everything's clear here. Looks good. All right, so it's just a glitch on my end, but everything seems to be working fine. All right, thank you for the comments. So good to have everybody here. I hope that Facebook will continue to work this evening so we can continue the comments and things like that. This study came about simply because whenever the pandemic started, when everything was happening, we realized that we weren't going to have our Sunday night service, and I wanted to do something for that Sunday night so that we had at least some type of Bible teaching. And so I just did what I called pandemic hermeneutics, and then that led to some questions about Revelation, and then that led to some more questions about Revelation, and so we just decided let's just go ahead and let's do a study on the book of Revelation. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to look tonight at chapters 4 through 7. What we're doing is giving you an overview. Now, it's absolutely impossible to cover every single detail and every single thing about Revelation in 30 to 45 minutes. It's difficult to do that. So I hope that you will take some notes, you'll write some things down, and the biggest thing that I can tell you is to study this for yourself, to read the passage with some of the notes that I'm going to give you, and that'll help you in learning more about this book that is designed to help us. It's designed to encourage us. As I've said a couple of different times in our study, the book of Revelation is to help us, to encourage us. I get this working. There we go. No audio on the live feed from the website. All right. It should be now. I'm seeing everything good on this part, so it should be good. Everything is going out on that. Okay, so the book is about Jesus and about hope. It's written to Christians in the first century. It is those Christians that are experiencing persecution. It's for that time. And the biggest thing is, as we've said before, it's a picture book. It's full of imagery. And so don't ever forget that as you're studying that. We're really going to see that tonight. And it's very dependent upon the Old Testament. Now, what we've been doing is we're breaking this down into sections. And those sections are 7 different groups or divisions, if you will. We have the 7 candlesticks. That's what we looked at last week. And that is those letters to the 7 churches. It's chapter 1, which is introductory. In fact, let me step over here real quick. Here's an outline of chapter 1. And it's that introduction and the vision. And then chapters 2 and 3 is the 7 churches, those 7 candlesticks. And you see those names there. And we gave them names to help us remember what it was they were dealing with, what it was they were commended for or condemned for. And that's why we gave them those names. I'd encourage you to go back and look at last week's lesson on that. We went through it real fast, but we give you an overview of that. And then today we're going to look at 4 through 7. But I want to go ahead and show you once again this overview, this outline that we're going to be using. And that is the 7 candlesticks, chapters 1 through 3. And tonight we're going to look at the 7 seals of judgment. And then the next one will be the 7 trumpets. And then that's followed by the 7 symbolic figures, the 7 bowls of wrath, the 7-fold judgment, and 7-fold triumph. And so that's what we're going to be looking at tonight in chapters 4 through 7 are the 7 seals of judgment. And this is really where the apocalypse begins, if you will. We're going to see this when we get into chapter 6. And there's a whole lot going on in these chapters. I hope we can get through the whole thing, but if not, we will go as far as we can and we'll pick up next week on this. But the first thing I want you to notice is chapter 4, as you see the throne in heaven. And then chapter 5 is going to be the scroll in heaven. And then chapter 6 is broken out into those 7 seals being open. And you can see those names there, and we'll explain that as we move through the study. And then chapter 7 is actually an interlude, and then we'll continue from there. So, beginning our study, let me ask you a quick question. Have you ever wondered what heaven looks like? You know, we who are striving to live our lives the way that the Bible tells us to, you know, we are longing for that day. We're longing to be there. And have you ever just sat back and wondered, I wonder what heaven looks like? We don't have to wonder too much, because that's exactly what chapter 4 and 5 is all about. We're about to get a glimpse into heaven. And so get your Bibles, open them to chapter 4, and we're going to see this first chapter. Chapter 4 is going to focus primarily on God in heaven, and then you're going to see it focusing primarily on Jesus still in heaven. And the book, or this section, chapters 4 through 7, begins with a scene in heaven and it ends with a scene in heaven. Beautiful picture, thrilling imagery that you're about to see, frightening imagery in some places, but in either way, an incredible scene. Now, as we have said before in our study, remember, this is a vision. You're going to see that in the very first verses of this passage. It's a vision where John is seeing things and then trying to describe them to us. And that's why he uses the imagery and the words that he does. So let's begin reading. Let's read beginning at chapter 4, verse 1. It says, After these things I looked, and behold, a door standing open in heaven. And the first voice which I heard was like a trumpet speaking with me, saying, Come up here, and I will show you things that must take place after this. Immediately I was in the Spirit, and behold, a throne set in heaven, and one sat on the throne. And one who sat there was like a jasper and a sardis stone in appearance, and there was a rainbow around the throne in appearance like an emerald. Now let's stop right there for a second, because as I mentioned earlier, there's so many things in here. There's nowhere we can cover every detail of every single part of this verse. You can study Revelation in depth for a long time. So hopefully I'll just give you an overview. There's a lot of important things here. One, notice, as I said earlier, he's in a vision. He says he's in the Spirit. That's indication that this is a vision taking place, and that he is invited to come up here. So once again, if I go back over to our PowerPoint, chapter 4 reveals this scene of heaven. Chapter 5 is going to show the Lamb, and then you're going to see those opening of the seals. Now he says it opens the door in heaven. I want you to imagine, as I ask you, have you ever seen heaven? Could you imagine John in the Spirit, in this vision, seeing this door that's open to be able to glimpse into heaven? Now, I'm going to share on my PowerPoints and some of the things that I have some pretty incredible imagery. We have our own imagination of what we can think of what this looks like, and that's what this book is for, is to help you think and picture it in your mind. But some people have gone and drawn things or painted things to kind of give some ideas of maybe what that would look like. And one that I found is quite incredible is this artwork by Pat Marvenko Smith. So we purchased these to be able to broadcast these legally without going over the copyright or anything like that, or violating the copyright. But I would encourage you to Google Revelation artwork. And some of the artwork that's out there is incredible. Some of it is quite fantastic, as in it goes overboard to some degree. Some of it actually is also showing false doctrine and the things that they're painting and showing. But it's very interesting to see. So I'm going to share some of that with you, mainly this of Pat Smith. And so this beginning is this scene in heaven. I want you to imagine this big scene. And we're going to describe this in a little bit more detail, but I want you to pay attention as we're reading through the passage. We'll look at that detail, and I'll show you this scene of heaven and what we're looking at. So he goes, first of all, I want you to notice the first thing is that he sees a throne set in heaven. This is the center of the universe. You know, scientists have looked to try to find where the universe began. They have come to realize that the universe is expanding, and it's expanding out from a central point. What is that central point? And all kinds of interesting scientific things. You want to know where the center of heaven is? The center of the universe, the center of all existence? Right here, Revelation chapter 4, verse 2. A throne set in heaven. That's the center of it all. And here's God sitting there. Now notice, it says one. It doesn't say exactly who it is. It also doesn't describe God in any kind of human terms. You notice that? One who sat on the throne, and he sat there, was like a jasper and sardis stone. Looking at the comments here, Brother Jack Davis writes on here, always keep in mind, it's not literal. That's exactly right. Look at what it says when it says like a jasper, like a sardis stone in appearance. This is a vision, and so never forget that. So we're looking at this, and notice it looks like a rainbow around the throne. You know, there's, again, no human description. Instead, he's using these things like precious stones and stuff like that to try to describe this incredible vision that he saw. And so you see these things, and one, you see this rainbow around it. Now, a rainbow typically represents the end of a storm. Usually that's when you see it, especially in the Bible in Genesis chapter 6. That was one of the things after the great flood, is that God promised Noah he would never flood the earth again. It was after the storm. And notice the color of the rainbow. It's emerald. You know, our rainbows are many different colors. This one is emerald. What's the color of the earth? The primary color is blue and green, an emerald color. And so this is representing all of life. The storm is over. That's what you're seeing here. And around the throne, continuing in verse 4, around the throne, and please pay attention as we're reading through this, all the elements that you see of heaven. Around that throne were 24 thrones, and on the thrones I saw 24 elders sitting, clothed in white robes, and they had crowns of gold on their head. And from the throne proceeded lightnings and thunderings and voices, and there were 7 lamps of fire burning before the throne, which are the 7 spirits of God. Now, isn't that interesting? And this is one of the things you need to realize about Revelation, is a lot of times it will explain what something is. Here it says there's these 7 lamps of fire, and that is the 7 spirits of God. And we'll talk about that more in just a second. Before the throne there was a sea of glass like crystal, and in the midst of the throne and around the throne were 4 living creatures, full of eyes in front and back. All right, let's talk about those for just a second. All these different things that we see happening in heaven. So first we have these thrones, these 24 thrones, 24 elders, it says. So, you know, we want to question or wonder what that is. And we don't know exactly, but you could probably speculate. Well, there were 12 tribes in old Israel, in the Israel of the Old Testament, and there were 12 apostles in the New Testament. When you take those, you get 24, and therefore that represents the leaders of religion, the leaders of the Israel and spiritual Israel, literal and spiritual Israel. And these are the ones that are wearing, says, white robes. That white means purity. And the robes that you read about whenever Jesus talked about the different parables of the wedding feast and how you'd have that wedding garment, and how that many times it's described. And you're going to see that white robe come into play in just a moment whenever we get into the seals. But here, they're wearing these robes and crowns. Now, this crown that they're wearing is a very specific type of crown. The Bible uses 2 words for crown. One of them is a crown as in authority, as in a king. The other is a crown which is victory. You think about the Olympians that wear those leaflet crowns. That's what this is. It is the word Stephanos, which means victory. These are ones that have won the victory. Now, we've talked about how this was for Christians in persecution. That's the whole purpose of this, is to show persecuted Christians God is still in control. God is in control, and so here in this vision, Jesus, through that angel that we read about in verse 1 in chapter 1, is revealing to the church, revealing to these Christians this scene of heaven. And God is in control, and He has authority and power and things like that in this incredible scene that you see with these lightnings and thunderings and this sea of glass. You notice that's an interesting thing, this sea of glass that's there. It says it was like crystal. It doesn't say it was an actual sea. It says it was like crystal. And in the midst of the throne and around the throne were those living beings. Again, so much. It doesn't say exactly how everything is arranged, but I want to show you a graphic that I use here that helps kind of lay everything out as far as this throne room scene. So it starts out by saying there was one on the throne that was like jasper. Okay, and that color of that is kind of this orangey color, and in that was God sitting on there. And there's the throne in the center. And then as you proceed, it says that there were lightnings around it. You see that in verse 5, those lightnings. And then it says that there was voices and thunderings and stuff coming around there. So this is around the throne. And then around that was that emerald rainbow. And then around that is those four beasts. If you continue to go out from the throne and looking at the verse 5, you see that those seven candlesticks, or the seven lights that were, that's the Spirit. And then you have that sea of glass like crystal. And then as you go around or further out, you get those 24 thrones of those elders sitting on the thrones. And then around that, if you want to go ahead and jump over with me, and you'll look in chapter 5, verse 11, you'll see where it talks about angels around that throne. And then in verse 13 of chapter 5, you see all living creatures. And so what I want you to see, and what I hope that you gather from this, is this picture. And again, it doesn't give the exact arrangement of how everything is, but this picture that everything is around the throne. That God is the center, and that's the focus. God is the center. He's in control. So going back to our picture of Mrs. Smith here, where you see this picture of how she depicts it, is this throne sitting there. There's those elders around it. You can see all those angels and everything around that throne, those four living beasts, and living creatures, I should say. And so that's the image that you get. Now, let's move forward and look at those four living creatures, because that's something that always gets people's attention. These living creatures. Now, the King James Version calls them beasts. That's probably where I slip of a tongue saying that a minute ago. That's actually not a good what do you call that? Interpretation. Because really it should be living creatures. These are living creatures. And we're going to dive into this and explain this. But look at those four living creatures, and look how they're described in verse 7. The first living creature was like a lion. Remember, we talk about vision. We talk about figurative language when he uses the word like. It's not actual. It's not what it really is. Even in that painting you see right there, it was like that. So like a lion. The second living creature was like a calf. The third living creature had a face like a man, and the fourth living creature a flying eagle. And the four living creatures, each having 6 wings, were full of eyes, round and within, and they do not rest day and night, saying, Holy, 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 Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. Whenever the living creatures give glory and honor and thanks to him who sits on the throne, who lives forever and ever, the 24 elders fall down before him who sits on the throne and worship him, and who lives forever and ever, and cast their crowns before the throne, saying, You are worthy, O Lord, to receive glory, honor, and power, for you created all things, and by your will they exist and are created. All right. So we have these four living creatures that you see there in that painting, or maybe you had your own idea what they look like, but there's very interesting descriptions here. One describing these four different type of living creatures, and each one of those is said to represent different aspects of creation, different aspects of even Jesus' ministry and who Jesus is. So first, you notice it says the face of a man, a face of a lion. Well, what do we typically say about the lion? He is the king of the jungle. And so what that represents is strength and power. The next one you see is like a calf. And typically a calf or a beast of burden or something along those lines is typically used for service. That's what they are for, is in lines of service, pulling plows and different things like that. The other thing that is mentioned is that of a man, and that represents, or is said to represent, intelligence. And then finally you have the eagle, which is swift and able to carry out and travel. And so what we see here is four different aspects of all of mankind, of all of living creatures, of everything that's been created. Now, other people have taken this and said, well, there's also a correlation in the four gospel accounts that we have. For example, in Matthew, he appears as the lion, the king, the lion of the tribe of Judah. In Mark, he's portrayed as a servant. In Luke, he is portrayed as the Son of Man, as that intelligence. And then in John, he's shown as being like the Son of God, or is the Son of God, flying out as in that eagle. So I find that quite interesting, that correlation or that comparison that people have there. I see so many people that are coming on Facebook. So good to have you with us. Thank you for your comments. Glad to have you with us. And if you have a question or comment, be sure and write on here, and I'll do my best to get to it. So we have these four living creatures that seem kind of scary, especially when you look at verse 8, and it says that they have 6 wings. Have you ever seen a bird or an animal with 6 wings? Well, actually you have. If you stop and think about insects, some insects have multiple wings. And so it's not out of creation, out of the realm of creation, that God can make this. Don't forget, this is a vision. But here, these 6 wings, what does that provide? Speed, agility, and be able to get to where they need to go. Notice that they have eyes inside and out. Again, this is said to represent that they're all seeing. They can see every direction, both within themselves and outside, and that they do not rest. Their whole job is to do the bidding of God, to constantly be working, constantly be, as it says here, crying out day and night, holy, holy, holy Lord God Almighty. Some of y'all who like to sing in our congregational singing recognize that, don't you? We sing that song, holy, holy, holy Lord God Almighty. I love that. Now, these are some special order of being. You stop and think about the fact that we human beings are creation of God. You also have, and is talked about, angels. Jesus talked about angels. The Bible talks about angels. So there's a different type of living creature. And then we also know about demons, as we have seen and read about. I say seen. We've read about in the Bible that they dealt with in the first century. And then here we have these 4 living creatures, a different kind, a different class of living creature. And so it just shows that we don't have all the answers as to what God's creation entails or what's involved in that. So we just have this description. But you remember whenever I said that Revelation leans heavily on the Old Testament. I want to show you this because this shows us exactly how this comes about, or the comparison. See, John, whenever he writes this, he's not only writing and trying to describe things that he has seen in earthly terms, but he can also draw from the Old Testament. Prophets have used these same words in different ways. Yes, exactly as Jack is showing here in Isaiah 6, the seraphim, as you can see here, and also in Ezekiel chapter 1 and verse 10. So look at what the comparison is that we have here. If you look at Revelation chapter 4, we have these four beings. Well, in Ezekiel chapter 1 and chapter 10, he also has four beings that he describes. Now, Isaiah chapter 6 doesn't give a mention of the number of beings, but then the next thing is you have full of eyes. Isaiah 6, again, doesn't mention any eyes, but Ezekiel mentions that it's full of eyes. In Revelation, it also says they have four faces. There are these four different faces. That's the same thing you see in Ezekiel. There's no mention of faces in Isaiah. And then it talks about here in Revelation having 6 wings. Now there's the difference that you see in Ezekiel. He describes them as having 4 wings. But Isaiah, he does talk about them having 6 wings. In Revelation, these are praising God. In Ezekiel, it's talking about them flying around. In Isaiah, they are praising God. And in Ezekiel, they're called cherubs. And in Isaiah, they're called seraphim. Now here, in Revelation, he doesn't give them a name. But don't you find that interesting that in 2 different places in the Old Testament, you have descriptions almost identical? And that's why we don't need to be afraid of Revelation. As we've been saying since the beginning of this study, there's a lot here. There's a lot here that is pulled from imagery of the Old Testament. The Christians who would have received this in the first century are familiar with the Old Testament and probably immediately went, oh, that sounds like Isaiah. That sounds like Ezekiel, because it's imagery that they have read before, or that's part of their literature, part of their history, part of their culture. So very important to remember that as we compare these. All right. Now notice again what these creatures do is they're there to worship. And that's the main point. There's what you need to understand. And let me make this point real quick. As far as these beings that you see in these descriptions, we've said this many times. We're going to continue to say it throughout this study. This is a vision. Anything's possible in a vision. Anything's possible in figurative language. What winds up happening in regards to false doctrine, especially when we get to chapter 12 and we start seeing those beasts that come out of the sea and that come out of the earth, is that people take, and we're going to see that here in a few minutes when we get into some of the other parts of this, people take figurative language and want to make it literal. And that's where you wind up with false doctrine. Or somebody wants to take and try to make everything figurative. That's just as wrong there too. So we got to be careful with how we deal with apocalyptic language. So that's very clearly talking about these incredible looking beings. But he goes back to the elders, and notice that the same thing that the beings are doing, the elders are going to do also. Again, talking about worship, the 24 elders fall down before him who sits on the throne and worships him who lives forever and casts their crowns before the throne. Now, that crown that they got, they throw that down before the throne. Here's a different picture from Mrs. Smith once again, showing that those elders, showing these are intelligent beings, which teaches us a little bit about heaven, that we're going to know what we're doing once we get there. And these intelligent beings are rendering this homage, this veneration to God. And that shows, and here's the lesson for us, is that all of creation is going to bow to God. Every knee is going to bow. That's what the picture is here. That's what heaven is all about. And so, as they say, you are worthy. You are worthy, O Lord, to receive glory and honor and power, for you created all things. And by your will, they exist and are created. Literally means by the means of your will, they are created. God spoke it into existence because that's what he willed to do. If he's the creator and he speaks it into existence, then he certainly has the authority and the power that we should render that worship to him, just like we see those elders doing here. All right, so much there in chapter 4, as you can see, and I hope that gives you a little bit better overview of that chapter. And it continues. So we're still in heaven. We're still in this scene, but now it's going to change a little bit. Notice now what he says. Let's read these verses. And I saw in the right hand, chapter 5, verse 1, in the right hand of him who sat on the throne, a scroll, written inside and on the back, sealed with 7 seals. So now we've got this description of this throne room. We've seen what this throne looks like and this imagery of heaven. And now we're going to get into some detail. John sees in the right hand of he who is sitting on the throne, a scroll. Now this scroll, notice, is written on the inside and on the outside. That meaning it's full. And what does that mean? This means it is the will of God. It contains that which is written. It's full. No more can be added to it. No more be taken away. It's written. What is written is written. And we see, therefore, this being the will of God. And it's sealed, not with just 1 seal, but with 7 seals. Now, seals are important, and people in the first century would have understood this. And this was a common practice even for many centuries afterwards, and even still to some degree today. And that is, when you seal up a document, whenever you have a letter or a document that you're going to be sending to someone that is an official letter, that is something that is being sent that you don't want somebody else seeing, that it's only for their eyes, then you typically would seal it with wax, with a seal, an official seal. Because what happens is you take, as you see in the picture there, you take some wax and you melt that where the scroll closes or the envelope closes. You put that wax on there, and typically a king or an authority would have a stamp or even a ring sometimes that would have an image on it, and they would put that into the wax, which then leaves that image on there, sealing it closed. And the only way that you could know that indeed you were the only one to see that, if you're receiving that letter, is when that seal is broken. You break that seal. So that's what this is. It's sealed. God's will is sealed in this scroll that is written, and there's 7 of them. Now you've heard us talk about many times how there's numbers, and we're going to see these numbers over and over. Just a minute ago we saw 24 elders. Well, now we have the word 7, and 7 means complete, total. We're going to see that a few times in this chapter. It is the complete will of God. And the fact that there's 7 seals that need to be opened shows that there's a progression that we're going to see in chapter 6 when we get to those seals. So he continues, then I saw a strong angel proclaiming with a loud voice, who is worthy to open the scroll and loose its seals? And no one in heaven or on earth or under the earth was able to open the scroll or to look at it. Again, that Mrs. Smith has a pretty interesting painting here. You talk about a strong angel. This guy has muscles, and there he is. And you imagine that scroll that is sealed up, and John sees it and says, no one is able to open it. In verse 4, look at the response of that. So I wept much because no one was found worthy, key word, worthy to open and read the scroll. Worthy to open the scroll and read it or to look at it. So that is something that's very important for us to understand. The fact that man's destiny is in there, but yet man can't open that scroll. There's nobody on earth that can open that scroll, and so John cries. I was reading Amy's comment, or maybe proof of who it comes from. That's right. That's exactly proof of who it comes from. Great point. Now look at what happens in response to John weeping when he was mourning. But one of the elders said to me, do not weep. Behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, has prevailed to open the scroll and to loose its 7 seals. Now, Jesus is described as a lion. If you look in Genesis chapter 49, verse 10, you're going to see a prophecy about the Messiah. And it calls him that prophecy of him coming, that he will be a judge. Let's go ahead and read that. Genesis chapter 49, verse 10. Again, appealing to the Old Testament here in Revelation, the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet until Shiloh comes, and to him shall be obedience of the people, as in a king. Remember we talked about a lion being the king of the jungle. Well, here he is. He's depicted as a lion. Now, I want you to pay close attention to some descriptors here. Number one, John said that no one is worthy. That's the key word. No one is worthy to open the scroll. And then Jesus is described as a lion and coming from that tribe of Judah, as we saw in Genesis 49, verse 10. And I looked, and behold, in the midst of the throne of the four living creatures, and in the midst of the elders stood a lamb, as though it had been slain. Let's go back to our scene real quick. And notice now we add one more. That letter C there on the side there, there's Christ standing there. Isn't Christ called the Lamb of God? That's what John called him whenever John the Baptizer sees him and says, "Here is the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world." But did you notice that in the same chapter, he is described as a lion and a lamb? Now, what does that teach us? It teaches us that this is figurative language. Jesus Christ is neither a lamb or a lion. He is simply being described in that. And again, there's a painting by Mrs. Smith. And notice that lamb, how it's described. It's kind of interesting as well as far as a vision is concerned. It says that, "And I looked, and behold, in the midst of the throne of the four living creatures, in the midst of the elders stood a lamb as though it had been slain, having 7 horns and 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits of God sent out to all the earth. Then he came and took the scroll out of the right hand of him who sat on the throne." And so you have this rather strange picture of this lamb. But what you mainly see there is as a lamb that was slain. In other words, there was a sacrifice that was made. But you see Jesus described as a lion and as a lamb. He's both powerful and he's meek. He has given that sacrifice, but he still is the king. And so you see these descriptors, this figurative language. If that doesn't teach you about figurative language, I don't know what else the Bible could do or how else it could describe it when you're using 2 different ways to describe Jesus in order to show that this is figurative. This is simply a vision. Jack writes on here, "The lamb is dead but alive." That's the other great aspect of this. He has risen. And we're going to see in a little bit as we move forward in the study that not only is the lamb risen, but he's also become the shepherd, elevated to become and be that shepherd. So what do we see here? We see that only one person is worthy to open up the will of God, to execute the will of God, to enact it, and to break those seals in that progression, and that is Jesus Christ, his Son, the King, the Messiah. So this is, again, all to help people in the first century. Now let's go ahead and continue reading and see what we see. Verse 8, "Now when he had taken the scroll, the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders fell down before the Lamb." Notice that before they fell down before the throne, before God who sits on the throne. Now they're falling down before the Lamb. What does that tell you about the deity of Christ? It shows that he is worthy of that as well as God, that he is part of that Godhead. "He fell down before the Lamb, each having a harp and golden bowls full of incense, which are the prayers of the saints." Now right here, I've seen this used many times to say, there you go, we can have instrumental music in the church. They have harps in heaven. Well, before you get too carried away, look at what else it says. Notice in the same sentence, it says harps. It also says bowls full of incense, which are what? The prayers of the saints. Again, figurative language. Remember, we keep talking about that. Figurative language. People want to grab something and make it literal. This is still figurative language. And that same language that's used right there, you see that as a precursor in the Old Testament. In Exodus chapter 30, God gave instructions to Moses on how to build the tabernacle and all the furniture that goes in the tabernacle. And one of those things was an altar of incense. And that altar stood before the curtain that separated the holy from the holy of holies. And that incense would waft or drift into the Holy of Holies. We see that same thing in Luke chapter 1, verse 9, when Zechariah was offering that incense whenever the angel came to him. And here it's described, that incense is described as prayers, our prayers of the saints, of the Christians, of the believers that rise up before God. Amy writes, this analogy reminds me of the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, the slain Lamb who is alive. That's a great point, because that's the other thing you're going to see in Revelation. He's going to appeal back to chapter 1. Remember all those descriptors of Jesus Christ whenever he described himself. You're going to see that again over and over all the way through the book of Revelation. So he continues with this figurative language of these harps and these bowls of incense. This is simply written to show the honor and the worship that they're giving to God. It's what we're doing to give to God that's pleasing to him. And they sang a new song, saying, "You are worthy to take the scroll and open its seals, for you were slain and have redeemed us to God by your blood. Out of every tribe and tongue and people of nations have made us kings and priests to our God, and we shall reign on the earth." Now notice it says that all the people and all the nations. That's because Christianity is available to all ethnicities, all races, if you will. It's open to all of mankind. And better than saying, you have made us kings, if you look at the interpretation of that, is made us into a kingdom. We're part of a kingdom. We do reign as kings, if you will, in this kingdom. We're part of a great and wonderful kingdom that extends from now all the way up into heaven. And that kingdom exists now. If you go back into our beginning study, we're looking in chapter 1, and even some of the introductory material, we're talking about how John says in chapter 1, verse 9, he's in that kingdom now. And so that's an important point to realize that this is a kingdom. It's not Judaism. Judaism is passed away, is gone. Now we are in this kingdom. Then I looked, and I heard the voice of many angels around the throne, the living creatures, the elders, and the number of them was 10,000 times 10,000 and thousands of thousands. Again, figurative language, not literal, simply to say it's innumerable. You can't hardly count. There's so many thousands, saying with a loud voice, "Worthy is the Lamb who is slain to receive power and riches and wisdom, strength and honor and glory and blessing." If you've been paying attention, have you noticed that we get glimpses into what that worship entails? If you back up in chapter 4, verse 8, you get the first one. They said, "Holy, holy, holy." And then in verse 11, it talks about, "You are worthy, O Lord." And then we get over here in this one, and in verse 9, you see another glimpse into what's being said in worship here in 12, and he's going to continue. All right, even every creature, verse 13, which is in heaven and on the earth and under the earth, which are in the sea, are all in them, I heard saying, "Blessed and honor and glory and power be to him who sits on the throne and to the Lamb forever and ever." Isn't that interesting that we see all this taking place, where we get these glimpses into heaven and we get to actually hear the words that are being used? I find that fascinating and love to see that. Now, the things that they're saying about Jesus, the fact that he is worthy to receive power and riches, means that he is capable of protecting us. He is capable of being our shepherd. He's capable of everything that he set out to do. Now, again, this was written for the benefit of the church. This was to help the church in a time of difficulty. Whenever they are experiencing persecution, whenever they are in the tribulation, as is said in chapter 1, verse 9. That tribulation that was happening then continues till today. Persecution that happens then continues today. Can you imagine someone in, say, the country of Iran who is being persecuted because their Christianity is illegal? Even in places in China, it is illegal to be a Christian. They will kill Christians in some places in the Middle East. Could you imagine, again, in 2020, the night before your execution, somebody hands you this letter of Revelation and you read this about how God is almighty, God is sovereign, God is sitting on the throne, and this is what you're heading toward. Wouldn't that encourage you? That's the point. That's the point of this. It's not to scare us. It's not to make us feel afraid, but instead to encourage us. So don't ever forget, it was written for the benefit of the church. All right. Chapter 6 and 7 is really where the apocalypse actually begins. Because now he's going to start opening those seals, and we start seeing some pretty exciting and scary things happening in that. And that's really, whenever you think about it, chapters 1 all the way up to 5 were kind of introductory material. It was showing the things that were. And remember when we started this in chapter 4, it says things that must take place. In other words, this is a future vision. You're going to get to see the end of the world. You're going to get to see how history is going to end by this progression of these seals. And it's very fascinating and has a lot of things that we can learn from it. Now, we've been going for 45 minutes, and this time, as I promised you last week, I did not rush through this. I was trying to give you some better detail, but it also takes time, and so I didn't know how far I was going to get tonight. It looks like I only got through 2 chapters, which leaves us 2 chapters left. Chapters 6 and 7, and I want to give proper detail to those because there's a lot we can learn in there. So next week, next Sunday, we will continue in this section of chapters 4 through 7, and we're going to look at those seals. I would encourage you between now and then to read all of this. Read all the way from chapter 1 all the way up to chapter 7 and get the whole picture. And then what we will do is we will look at these seals, and we'll even go further than that if we get through chapters 6 and 7 next week. We'll continue on into chapter 8. But there's a lot of great things there, and there's some things in there that people misconstrue, that there's false doctrines come out of, people misunderstand, but there's nothing in there that should be like that. It's all written for the benefit of the church, to help us, encourage us, and show us that God is indeed in control. That's the whole point of this section right here. God is in control. All right. So again, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'm glad that Facebook cooperated tonight with us, as well as it looks like YouTube and our website worked out real well. These are being recorded and on YouTube, so you can go back and look at some of these. And I hope, again, that this is really helping you with your understanding of Revelation. I thank you again for joining us. Be sure and be with us and join us next Sunday. If you are a member of Margaret Street, please share this video with your friends or with your family. Let others know about it. And if you are not part of Margaret Street, we would love to have you come be a part of our congregation and learn more about the Bible, as we're striving to do all those things that are according to the pattern in the New Testament. And we'd love to explain more to you about that as well. Again, thank you for joining us. I'm going to sign off now. God bless you, and I hope you have a great rest of your week.